In the quiet heart of Rome, night has softly folded itself over stone and marble, over arches and columns and tangled streets, until the great hollow of the Forum lies like a shallow bowl of darkness between the hills. The air is cooler now than it was in the day, and the last traces of heat have sunk down into the paving stones, where they linger as a faint, stored warmth beneath the soles of passing feet. High above, the sky is no longer purple from the afterglow of the sun, but a deep, dense blue that is almost black, scattered with a few pale, watchful stars that look down through drifting threads of smoke and mist. Around the edges of the Forum, the silhouettes of temples and basilicas form a ring of quiet geometry. Their pediments and columns are no longer picked out in clean daylight. Instead, they stand as massive, shadowy presences, their lines softened by the darkness, their details melted into suggestion. Bronze doors are shut, statues that blazed gold in the sun are now only dim, looming shapes. The great arches that commemorate victories rise like fossilized waves at the edge of some dark sea, frozen mid-crest. Somewhere out in that obscurity, a cart rattles over the stones, wheels hitting the slight joins and ridges in the pavement one by one. The sound travels clear and thin through the emptied space, then fades, leaving behind only the soft, intermittent scrape of a sandal on stone as a late passerby takes a shortcut home. A dog barks once, twice, then decides that nothing is worth the effort, and curls back into whatever hollow it has claimed for the night. The smell of the day has thinned, less sweat, less dust, less acrid tang of urine and spilled wine, more of stone itself, cold and mineral, breathing out the memory of the sun. At one edge of this quiet bowl stands a small, round temple whose presence is more felt than loudly announced. It is not the largest building in the Forum, not the tallest, not the most ornate, yet there is a quality of centeredness about it, a sense that some necessary thread of the city begins here, winds outward, and then returns. This is the Temple of Vesta, the goddess whose hearth is the symbolic heart of Rome. Its low columns are wrapped in darkness, but between them, just at the level of the doorway, there is a slit of living light, a soft, steady band of gold that spills from within and lies like a warm, glowing tongue across the threshold. Behind the temple, half embracing it and half withdrawing into its own interior world, lies the house of the Vestals. Its long courtyard, framed by rows of columns and cooled by stone basins of water, is hidden from the Forum by walls and angles, by changes in level and careful design. From where you stand, you can only sense its presence, like a quiet held behind a hand. The house, the temple, the old royal regia nearby, together they form a small, intricate cluster at the edge of the Forum, a knot of sacred responsibilities and ancient habits, wrapped now in a deeper darkness than the city around them, as if the night itself is leaning in to listen. You stand at the edge of that cluster, at the point where the open stone of the Forum narrows into a short passage leading toward the round temple. Behind you, streets and alleys coil back into the city. Ahead, the stone under your feet feels subtly different, more worn in the middle as countless feet have taken this same path, more polished at the corners where hands have brushed the walls in passing. The air here smells faintly of old smoke and clean ash, of wool cloaks aired in sheltered spaces, of river damp drifting in from the Tiber and being caught and stilled by stone. As you move forward, the open vastness of the Forum seems to recede behind you, like the sound of a distant shore when you step into a sheltered cove. The scattered noises of the city thin and soften, each footstep becomes clearer, each small sound, a cough, a murmur, the creak of a beam, seems closer and more personal. The sense of walking into a more intimate circle, into a space set apart, settles around you as lightly and unmistakably as a cloak. At the end of the short passage, the temple door stands open. Inside, the glow you saw from outside thickens into a steady, tender radiance that clings to the interior like a warm mist. You cross the threshold without a sound, and for a moment you feel the exact line where outside air and inside air meet, a slight difference in temperature, a slight change in the way your skin registers the world. Here, the air carries a constant note of wood smoke and faint incense, layered over years until it has sunk into stone and plaster, into the grain of the wooden bench and the fibers of woolen garments. In this circle of scented air and low light, one woman keeps watch. She stands very close to the hearth, not so near that the heat would sting her shins, but near enough that one hand can rest comfortably upon the smooth, warm stone rim. The light from the fire climbs up her body in a slow gradient, brightest at her feet, where it catches the edges of her sandals and the low hem of her stola, softer and more reddish around her hands and folded arms, gentler still at her face, where it picks out the curve of a cheekbone, the line of a jaw, a few faint shadows at the corners of her mouth and eyes. Her hair, gathered in the style of her order, shows threads of silver among the darker strands, and the thin lines at her forehead and around her eyes suggest years of squinting into sunlight during processions and of half-lidded watching in the dimness of this very room. She is not bent and not frail, but there is a certain careful economy in the way she holds herself, as if every movement now is chosen rather than automatic. This is a Vestal Virgin in the last years of her long service, a woman whose life has been measured in cycles of rituals and watchful nights for 3 full decades. The sacred fire before her is not a high, dramatic blaze. It is a contained, continuous presence, a heart rather than a storm. The coals at its base glow a deep, rich red, crusted with gray ash that breaks and cracks in delicate lines. Above them, small tongues of flame rise and fall in slow, irregular patterns, reaching up to lick the sides of the short logs laid in a careful arrangement. The wood itself is dry and seasoned, chosen precisely so that it burns with a consistent, clean flame, neither sputtering nor smoldering too heavily. You can hear the fire as well as see it, the soft, intermittent crackle of sap pockets collapsing, the tiny hiss when a grain of sand or a stray mote of moisture is caught and consumed, the faint, rustling sound of ash shifting and settling as embers move under their own weight. The sound is not loud, but it fills the round chamber in a way that makes silence feel alive rather than empty. Along the curved wall, a single oil lamp burns on a low stone shelf. Its flame is much smaller than that of the hearth, but steadier, a little, unwavering tongue of light that throws a gently quivering halo against the plaster. The smell of the lamp's olive oil adds a fruity note to the air, binding itself to the thin tendrils of wood smoke, so that breathing here feels like inhaling a mixture of resin and fruit, of ash and pressed olives, of something wild and something carefully cultivated. You stand nearby, close enough that the warmth of the hearth brushes your face, close enough that, if you wished, you could mirror the placement of your hand on the stone rim and feel the gentle heat soaking into your palm. The woman does not look toward you. Her gaze is fixed on the flame, not in a trance but in that sustained, deliberate attention that comes from long-practiced care. You are only a presence beside her, invisible and weightless, a quiet companion invited into this hour to share the slow rhythm of her vigil and the unhurried drift of her thoughts. Her breathing is calm and measured. You can almost see it in the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders beneath the thick white wool of her cloak, in the way the fabric shifts and settles. There is a sense, as you watch her, that her breath and the movement of the fire are somehow linked, not in any literal sense but in the way your mind begins to pair them. As she inhales, you notice a brighter flare. As she exhales, the flames seem to relax and fold closer to the logs. In, out. Lean, recover. In, out. The illusion is soothing, a small, private harmonization between human and hearth. Beyond the circle of light, the rest of the temple curves away into a gentler darkness. The floor underfoot is marble, cool to the touch where it lies in shadow, warmer where the firelight falls. You can see faint marks on it, tiny pits and scratches accumulated over years, places where a sandal heel dragged, where an ember fell and was quickly snuffed, where water splashed from some vessel carried past in haste. The marble reflects the firelight in long, soft streaks rather than clear mirrors. It is beautiful, but worn, softened by use. The round walls are plastered and painted simply. In this dimness, you cannot make out every detail of the decoration, but you sense borders, faint bands of color, perhaps a ghost of a pattern where red and yellow once stood out more clearly. The light from the fire climbs the walls unevenly, brighter near the hearth, fading higher up until, just below the roof, the plaster melts into true darkness. Above, the conical roof disappears into that darkness, its wooden ribs lost except where a faint gleam catches on a bronze fitting. At the very crown, a circular opening lets out the smoke and lets in a cool, invisible thread of night air. Through that aperture, a small patch of the sky is visible, a rounded window of deep blue-black where a few stars hang like distant coals, much colder and more remote than the ones burning at your feet. Sometimes a wisp of smoke curls upward, passes briefly across that patch of sky, and then escapes into the greater dark, its edges folding and dissolving. In this enclosed space, time feels different. It does not move in jolts or leaps, it stretches, lengthens, bends. The woman at the hearth has lived most of her adult life within rhythms like this, slow, circular, repeating, and you can feel how they have shaped her. Even as she stands still, her body seems perfectly adjusted to the long duration of night watches, to hours in which very little happens and yet everything depends on a small, ongoing task. After a span that might be minutes or much longer, she lifts the bronze tool resting near the edge of the hearth. It is a simple rod with a flattened end, polished by countless fingers. With it, she gently shifts one of the logs, nudging it so that a new edge faces the glowing heart of the coals. The log scrapes softly against the stone, ash crumbles and slides with a faint, sandy whisper. A shower of tiny sparks rises, bright pinpricks tracing brief arcs before they dim and vanish in the space of a breath. She watches carefully, making small adjustments, giving the fire time to respond. The new edge catches, a deeper orange glow spreads under the bark, a tongue of flame runs along it, pauses, then establishes itself with quiet confidence. Satisfied, she lays the rod down, the metal clicking lightly against the stone. Her hand returns to the hearth's rim, fingers splaying to feel the heat that has soaked into the stone, the warmth that has been accumulating here day after day, year after year. The fire is steady. The lamp is steady. Her breathing is steady. All the great complexities of the city outside, its laws, its politics, its ambitions, its fears, are held, for this moment, in these three quiet continuities. At length, when the fire's needs are temporarily resolved, she draws her hand away from the stone. The warmth lingers on her skin, glowing faintly beneath the paler chill of the air, as if the hearth has marked her for a while. She gathers the heavy folds of her cloak a little closer around her shoulders, feeling the coarse softness of the wool catch and drag slightly across the fabric of her tunic beneath. Her gaze lingers on the fire for one more long breath, almost like a farewell for this brief interval, and then she turns toward the doorway. The movement is unhurried, the turn of someone who has done this countless times, who knows exactly how much attention the flame still needs and exactly how long it can safely be left under someone else's watch, even if that someone is only the discipline embedded in her own body, the sure knowledge that she will return before the coals can slip toward danger. Her sandals make a faint, close sound on the marble floor as she walks, a soft slap and lift, that echoes just enough in the round space to remind you of its curves. The hem of her cloak brushes the stone in a whisper. When she passes by the lamp, the unsteady light from the hearth flickers briefly across her profile, picking out the hollow at her temple, the line of her nose, the slight downward turn of her mouth when her face is at rest. At the door, she pauses for a heartbeat, listening, not with her ears alone, but with the whole of the quiet attention she has trained over years. The fire behind her is behaving as it should, the night beyond the threshold is not pressing with any unusual sound or disturbance. She lifts the wooden bar from its brackets with a small, familiar flex of arm and wrist, the grain of the wood faintly rough beneath her fingers, and eases the door open just wide enough for her to slip through. The cool air of the passage meets her like water. It carries the smell of damp plaster and stone, a trace of the hillside's buried moisture, and the fainter, drier scent of old smoke clinging to walls that have seen generations of torches and lamps pass by. The sound of the hearth is immediately muffled once the door closes behind her. What remains is a soft, enveloping hush, broken only by the slight tap of her sandals and the low, steady flame of a wall lamp farther down the corridor. The passage between temple and house is not long, but at night it feels like a small, private world of its own, a throat connecting two vital organs. The stones underfoot are worn smooth where centuries of feet have walked in a narrow band down the center. Closer to the walls, the texture is rougher, less polished, crusted with tiny chips and irregularities. The walls themselves curve inward just enough to make the space feel intimate, the whitewash catching and softening the lamplight so that no corner is entirely dark. As she moves, her hand occasionally grazes the wall, fingers trailing over faint imperfections in the plaster, over hairline cracks that spider away from old repairs. These small lines and dents are like a record of the passage of time, a delicate script written in lime and dust, telling of earthquakes and settling foundations, of seasons of damp and seasons of drought. She does not consciously read them, but her body knows them, recognizes the tiny shifts in surface and angle without effort. At the far end of the passage, the space widens and opens into the house of the Vestals' inner courtyard. Stepping out into it feels like stepping into the center of a calm, stone-lined pool. The sky above is framed by the rectangle of the surrounding roofs, a cutout of dark blue that seems almost solid from the depth of its color. A few stars glimmer in that artificial frame, their light weak but steady, like distant signals that have finally reached Earth after a long journey. The air here is cooler than in the temple, the open space allowing the night's breath to move more freely. It carries the scent of water from the basins that run along the courtyard's length, a clean, almost metallic smell, tinged with algae and stone. The basins themselves are pale smudges in the dimness, strips of still surface that catch and distort any stray light. In some places, the water mirrors a scrap of starlight, in others, it holds only the shadow of the colonnades. Somewhere near the center, a trickle of water falls at regular intervals, the sound small but sharply defined in the quiet, a gentle ticking that measures a slower time than any sundial. Along the edges of the courtyard, within the embrace of the colonnades, stand the statues. They are arranged in a line, each one set upon a pedestal, each one draped in stone garments whose folds fall in measured, conventional rhythms. In daylight, their carved features are clearer, their faces recognizable as long-dead chief Vestals whose names are inscribed on their bases. At night, they are more ambiguous, pale forms in the darkness, their faces turned toward the central space as if watching some ritual that only they can see. The lamplight from the corridor behind the woman touches the nearest ones briefly, carving out a cheek here, a chin there, leaving the rest in quiet shadow. She steps under the shelter of the colonnade, the stone roof above her supported by columns whose capitals are lost in the dimness. Here, the air feels slightly drier, the stone beneath her feet more insulated from the coolness of the open courtyard. The sound of her steps is different too, a muted echo bouncing between the wall and the row of columns, a softened rhythm that seems comfortable, familiar. She pauses beside one of the statues and lifts her gaze to its face. The marble eyes look back with that blank, unseeing seriousness that carved faces have, but there is a sense of continuity in their presence. This woman, who once tended the same hearth, now stands forever in stone to watch over those who followed. The older Vestal's fingers brush the edge of the pedestal, tracing the carved letters of the name without really needing to read them. Her skin feels the shallow grooves, the sharpness of certain strokes that wear more slowly, the smoothed edges of others touched many times before. As she stands there, listening to the drip of water and the faint rustle of her own cloak as it shifts against her, a memory rises up in her with the naturalness of breath, drawn forth by the cold stone under her hand and the silent rows of her predecessors. In that memory, the night falls away, and you find yourself looking out through the eyes of a small girl standing in bright daylight on the stones of the forum. The air is hot and dry, the stones beneath her sandals seem almost alive with stored warmth. Voices swirl around her in currents and eddies, men talking in low tones, calling out names, laughing briefly before quieting, the shriller sound of a child protesting something in the distance, the clink of metal fittings on harnesses as a horse shifts its weight. She stands beside her father, her smaller hand enclosed in his. The wool of his toga itches against the side of her arm where it brushes her. She can smell the faint salt of his skin, the trace of whatever perfume or oil he used that morning to tame his hair. The weight of his attention is not on her now but somewhere ahead, where the Pontifex Maximus and his attendants are moving slowly through the gathering. Yet his hand is firm, not neglectful. She knows that if she turned and pressed her face into his side, he would lower his arm and hold her, just for a moment, until he thought better of such open display. Around them, the forum looks different from the way you just saw it in the night. Now it is crowded and loud, its stone surfaces broken into patches of shade and glare. The same temples and arches stand in their same places, but sunlight sharpens their details, carving shadows into column flutes and highlighting the veins in the marble. The round temple of Vesta is visible from a distance, its small size making it almost modest compared to some of the grander edifices around. The girl notices it only as part of the scene. She does not yet realize that it will soon shape the whole pattern of her life. When the Pontifex Maximus approaches, the energy in the crowd changes in a way even a child can feel. The murmur of voices drops, then rises again in a quieter tone, like a wave that has struck a barrier and spread out in a new direction. Men step back a little, some incline their heads. The priest's attendants move first, their garments gleaming in the sun, their staffs catching light. Then he appears, older, his face lined but composed, his bearing that of someone long accustomed to being the focal point of many gazes. The girl feels her father's hand tighten slightly around hers, a subtle squeeze that carries both pride and tension. They step forward when called. The Pontifex looks at the girl directly, his eyes assessing in a way that is not unkind but entirely impersonal, as if he is measuring not her as an individual but her fitness for a role that existed long before she was born and will continue after she is gone. He asks a few simple questions. His voice is clear and formal, the words shaped with habitual precision. The girl answers as she has been coached, giving her name, the name of her father and her family line. Reciting a short piece of a prayer she has been taught so often that the syllables fall almost of their own accord from her tongue. Her heart is beating fast enough that she can feel it pressing against her ribs, pressing against the thin wool of her dress, yet her voice does not tremble. Each word lands in the warm air and seems to hang there for a moment before dissolving into the buzzing sounds of the forum. She does not understand every nuance of the brief exchange between the men above her, between her father and the Pontifex, between the Pontifex and the scribe nearby who notes something down on a wax tablet, but she understands enough. She knows that girls have been chosen before, that to be chosen is both an honor and a kind of severing. She knows, from whispered conversations caught at the edges of adult talk, that this is something that will not be easily undone. When the Pontifex lifts his hand and lays it lightly on her head, his palm resting for a moment on her hair, the weight is not physically heavy, yet everything below it feels changed. There are words spoken, words about selection, about service, about Vesta and the state, about 30 years dedicated to the hearth of Rome. Those words do not yet have edges sharp enough to cut her, but they will sink in and deepen later. For now, she feels the world tilt slightly, as if the stones under her feet have shifted. Her father's grip loosens. Not abruptly, not cruelly, but with the inevitability of a ritual gesture that has been performed many times before. She does not weep or cling, the eyes upon her feel too numerous and too weighty for such displays. Instead, she releases his hand when he lets go, the warmth of his skin fading from her palm almost at once, replaced by the cooler touch of air. She steps forward when she is told, small feet moving on large stones, her shadow thin and frail amidst the heavier, longer shadows of the men around her. She is still herself, still a child who knows the smells of her mother's kitchen, the sound of her brother's laughter, the particular creak of the door at home, but already those things are beginning to retreat from the center of her life. Ahead of her, though she cannot see it yet through the press of bodies, lies the path to the temple and the house, to the long corridors and the round chamber of the hearth. Behind her, in the throng, there are many reactions. One mother exhales, relieved that her daughter has not been chosen. Another stands stiff, caught between pride and the peculiar mourning that comes when a child is given to the gods. Some faces watch with curiosity, others with indifference, others with a half-superstitious awe. The girl does not turn to see them. She walks forward with the pontifex, her steps placing themselves, as if the stones themselves are guiding her. The memory, held so long within the older Vestal, softens around its edges. The brightness of that day dims, the harsh outlines of shapes and faces blur. You feel it receding, like a picture placed back into a chest and covered with gently folded cloth. The courtyard around you returns, the cool stone underfoot, the pale statues with their unreadable expressions, the dripping of water into the basin. Beside you, the woman removes her hand from the carved letters and lets it fall back into the warmth of her cloak. The emotion that ripples through her now is not sharp grief or regret, but something quieter, a kind of distant ache that has worn smooth over time, like a pebble rounded at the bottom of a stream. What was once strange and overwhelming has become part of the baseline of her life, an accepted beginning to a long, particular path. After a little while, she begins to walk again, moving along the colonnade that frames the courtyard. Her pace is unhurried. Each step is placed with the unconscious exactness of long habit, the ball of the foot touching down just so on the slightly smoother strip of stone, the heel following in a controlled, quiet descent. The edge of her cloak trails over the floor behind her, its fringe occasionally catching on tiny irregularities in the stone and then releasing with almost inaudible snaps. As she moves, the spaces that open off the courtyard reveal themselves one by one. In the dimness beyond an archway, you glimpse rows of amphorae leaning against a wall, their rounded bellies catching a hint of reflected light, their narrow necks like a collection of patient, watching faces. This is a storeroom where oil and wine and grain are kept, where the air holds a dense, layered smell of dust and dried residue, of clay and straw. Farther along, another doorway opens onto a workroom. A stone mill stands there, its circular upper stone resting in a shallow depression in the lower one. Its handle projects outward, waiting for hands to take hold and turn, to grind grain into flour with slow, steady rotations. Nearby, low tables and shelves hold tools whose uses are obvious, bowls, knives, ladles, and others whose purpose is clear only to those who know the rites, bronze instruments for handling embers, sieves for sifting, molds for shaping offerings. In the stillness of night, these objects are nothing more than silhouettes, but you can almost feel the faint vibration of their daytime purpose lingering, like warmth in a seat after someone has just risen. Beyond that, a corridor leads toward the baths, now cold and deserted. The memory of warm steam and echoing voices clings faintly to the stones, along with the mineral tang of water that has flowed and drained away, over countless days. Her gaze passes each of these spaces without lingering. She knows them all intimately, has moved through them at every hour, in every season, under every kind of light, and tonight they require no special attention. It is near one of the kitchens that she pauses again. Here, even at night, the air seems denser, as if it remembers the day's heat more stubbornly. The smell of toasted flour and baked bread resides in the plaster and ceiling beams, subdued but unmistakable, a warm, nutty, comforting aroma that spreads out in a thin layer and then settles, ready to rise again whenever the room is warmed. There is a faint bitterness too, the ghost of smoke from fires banked under ovens, mixed with the high, clean scent of broom or thyme hung up to dry. She stands just outside the open doorway, her head tilted slightly, breathing in. The room beyond is dim, lit perhaps by a single, nearly spent lamp, its flame a tiny, shivering point in the darkness. Big clay jars stand near the walls, flat stones and boards rest on trestles, a wide, shallow bowl sits with a thin dusting of flour still clinging to its interior, turned to a pale, blurry sheen by the low light. The smell is enough. It folds back the years, and another memory rises, not daylight in the forum this time, but a bright morning in this very house, when she was not yet competent, not yet sure of her own hands. You see her younger self standing at one of those work tables, her hair bound but still with the softness of adolescence, her hands chalked with white dust. The room is full of movement and sound, the steady, grinding rasp of the millstone as another girl turns it, the scrape of a wooden paddle against the bottom of a pan, the quiet voice of a senior Vestal giving instruction. Sunlight pours in through an opening high on the wall, creating a diagonal band of brightness that cuts across the space, turning flower motes into tiny, swirling stars as they drift through it. On the table before the novice lies a shallow layer of toasted grain, still warm from the pan. Its color has deepened from pale beige to a gentle gold, and when she leans closer she can smell its transformation, a richer, more complex scent, somewhere between bread and toasted nuts, with a faint hint of sweetness that wasn't there before. Her task is to grind it further, to turn it into a fine meal that can be mixed with salt and used in the making of mola salsa, the sacred mixture that will dust sacrificial victims and altars. Her teacher stands nearby, watching with an expression that is stern but not unkind. The older woman has done these tasks for many years, her body carries the easy precision of long practice. She corrects the younger girl's hand position with small gestures, guiding the angle of fingers, the pressure of palm against grain. The girl listens with the intense focus of someone who understands that every detail matters, that even such seemingly mundane work is part of a chain of correctness that stretches outward into the entire life of the city. The novice feels the texture of the grain under her hands, coarse at first, then gradually finer as she works. The stone of the table is cool beneath her wrists, a stable presence against which the warmth of the grain and her own skin contrast. She becomes aware, in a distant way, of flour settling onto her arms, leaving pale smears on her brown skin. When she inhales, the air feels dry in her nostrils, the taste of grain powder leaving a faint film on her tongue. Around her, the movements of the others form a quiet choreography. One girl lifts a scoop of flour and passes it to another, someone else wipes down a surface with a damp cloth, leaving dark streaks that fade as the stone dries. The senior Vestal moves between them, adjusting, instructing, occasionally taking a tool in her own hands to demonstrate emotion. The sense in the room is not of rushed labor but of a practiced, ritualized industry, in which each small action is both practical and symbolic. Even at that age, the novice understands that what they make here will vanish almost as soon as it is used. The mola salsa will be scattered in pinches that disappear in smoke or run off with blood and wine, leaving little visible trace. Yet without it, the rites would feel incomplete, unanchored. In its very smallness and perishability lies its importance. This realization settles somewhere quietly inside her, forming one of the first layers of her adult understanding of sacred work, that significance does not always announce itself with grand gestures, that sometimes it is the repeated, almost invisible offerings that hold the world in place. The memory, like the grain under her young hands, is ground finer and finer as the years pass, until only certain textures and smells remain sharp. Now, in the present, those are what rise: the warmth of toasted flour, the dry tickle in the throat, the low, calm voice of instruction, the sense of being part of a pattern larger than herself. These impressions linger for a moment, then fade as gently as they came. Standing in the colonnade, the older Vestal lets out a slow breath. The smell from the kitchen doorway has already thinned, replaced by the cooler, more neutral scent of the night air in the courtyard. She draws her cloak a little closer, feeling the gathered wool settle more firmly around her shoulders, and continues along the colonnade toward the stair that leads upward. The staircase is of stone, its steps slightly cupped in the middle from long use. As she climbs, her sandals find the familiar hollows without thought. The air in the stairwell is cooler, with a faint, earthy smell that hints at the hillside pressing behind the house. Sounds from the courtyard, water's drip, faint stirring of leaves, the distant rush of the city's hidden life, grow softer, replaced by a closer, more enclosed hush. At the top, the corridor of the upper story stretches out in both directions. Small doors line its length, each leading to a cell-like room for one of the Vestals. The lamps hung at intervals along the wall are turned low, their little flames sheltered in clay or metal cups. They shed a modest, golden light that pools on the floor directly beneath them and fades quickly, leaving stretches of deeper shadow between. The plaster on the walls is plain, but the surface holds the faint marks of generations, finger smudges at doorframes, tiny chips near corners where something once struck, hairline cracks tracing irregular paths like fine, pale veins. Her own door is not marked by any special sign, yet she reaches it unerringly, as if guided by an invisible thread. Her hand touches the wooden panel, feeling the slight give of the old, well-seasoned planks, the shallow grooves where knuckles and fingers have pressed countless times. When she pushes it open, the hinges utter only the softest creak, quickly swallowed by the stillness inside. The room is small but not cramped, just large enough for a narrow couch along one wall, a low table, and a storage chest with bronze fittings. The lamp on the shelf has been left burning at its lowest, its flame barely rising above the lip of the vessel, yet it is enough to sketch the shape of the room in light and shadow. The whitewashed walls reflect the glow unevenly, turning what might otherwise be harsh contrasts into gentle gradients. The couch is neatly made, its mattress of woven material covered by a folded blanket of thick wool. The blanket's surface shows the slight roughness of frequent use, the nap flattened in some places, slightly pilled in others. A small cushion rests at the head, its stuffing shaped by countless nights of sleep into a form that fits the curve of her neck and skull. On the low table lies a simple ceramic cup turned upside down, a small cloth, perhaps a comb or a hair tie, the modest, practical belongings of a life regulated more by duty than by personal adornment. She steps inside and closes the door behind her, shutting out the corridor's faint draft. For a moment she simply stands, letting her body register the difference between the open space of the courtyard and the contained, familiar volume of this room. The air here smells of lamp oil and wool, of her own skin and hair, of the faint, leaf-like dryness of papyrus stored in the chest. It is a mixture that exists nowhere else exactly in this combination. Slowly, she unwinds the heavier layers of her cloak, loosening the folds around her throat and letting the wool slip from her shoulders. The sensation of the fabric sliding down her arms is almost luxurious in its quiet way, the weight shifting, the slight drag against the undertunic, the coolness that touches the skin left uncovered. She does not remove everything, her life does not allow for the kind of complete surrender to sleep that others might enjoy. But she does enough to ease the pressure on her ribs and neck, to give her lungs a little more room. She sits on the edge of the couch, the mattress yielding gently under her weight. Her feet rest on the floor, toes feeling the coarse weave of the small rug laid there to soften the contact with stone. Her hands rest in her lap for a while, fingers interlaced loosely, their knuckles showing faint pale ridges in the lamplight. She does not pray aloud, the hours already passed in ritual speech and silent devotion have filled that need. Instead, she allows her thoughts to slow and disperse, as if a tightly held bundle of threads has been loosened and allowed to fan out. You sit with her in that quiet, unseen. The solidity of the stone walls around you is comforting rather than confining, like the weight of a blanket. The muted light smooths out the harsh distinctions that daylight draws between objects, everything is reduced to essentials, light and dark, soft and hard, warm and cool. The bed invites rest, but there is still work to be done before dawn, and she feels, as she always has, the elastic pull of that obligation. After a time that cannot be counted by any outer measure, she rises again. The blanket falls back into place with a small sigh of fabric. She wraps the cloak around herself once more, hiding the pallor of her tunic and the fine bones of her wrists in the folds. Taking the lamp from its shelf, she cups it carefully in her hand, fingertips touching the rim of the clay, thumb braced against the base. The tiny flame quivers, reflexively reacting to the movement, then steadies, its light now traveling with her as she opens the door and steps back into the corridor. Her return journey through the house repeats the earlier path but feels subtly different, as if each space looks back at her with slightly altered eyes. The lamplight she carries casts new shadows on the walls, new shapes on the floor, making familiar angles appear fresh for an instant before settling into recognition. Her sandals whisper on the steps as she descends, the sound folded into the deeper hush of the night. Crossing the courtyard again, the air touches her face with the same cool breath, but now she notices how it slides along the line of her jaw, how it threads through the loose hairs that have escaped her bindings. The statues watch as they did before, the basins lie dark and still, with only the occasional tremor of water where a drip lands. Her lamp's small glow grazes the bases of the pedestals, the feet of carved figures, the lower trunks of the columns, briefly animating them with a traveling band of light. In the passage between house and temple, the flame creates a tunnel of warm color within the surrounding gray. The walls seem to lean in, closer to the warmth, showing their pitted surfaces and uneven repairs more clearly. Her shadow walks beside her, tall and thin, climbing and sinking as it crosses the bumps and hollows of the plaster. The smell of the temple's smoke reaches her before the door does, an olfactory promise that the hearth has behaved itself in her brief absence. At the threshold, she slides the bar from its brackets and pushes the door open with practiced gentleness. The air of the temple meets her like the breath of an old companion, warm, faintly gritty with suspended ash, heavy with the layers of accumulated scent. The lamp's small light joins the broader glow of the fire, its individual character subsumed into that larger radiance. Inside, the sacred flame has lowered slightly, as expected. The coals are more prominent than before, their deep redness visible under a thinner cover of ash. The logs have shifted a little under their own weight, edges charred, their grains more visible where the bark has cracked. The fire is not in danger, but it is at a point where a watchful hand is needed to preserve its calm progression toward dawn. She moves to the hearth with the same instinctive surety as before, setting the lamp in its accustomed place on the shelf. Kneeling, she leans in to read the fire, not only with her eyes but with the skin of her face and hands, with her ears trained to catch the slightest change in sound. The heat brushes her cheeks, warms the bridge of her nose, softens the cool stiffness of her fingers. Her eyes trace the borders between glowing and ashed portions of the wood, seeking where new fuel will be most welcome. With small, confident motions, she adds pieces of wood exactly where they are needed. One thin stick at the edge of a glowing bed, another bridging two embers, leaving gaps for the air to move. She knows from long experience how quickly the fire will respond, how much the flames will climb, how long this configuration will last before requiring attention again. Sparks rise in delicate, upward flurries, each one a tiny, brief star, sketching invisible paths in the air before fading. Once the fire is replenished and steady, she eases herself back, folding her legs beneath her as she takes her place on the low bench. From here, she can see the full circle of the hearth and the way its light strokes the inner surfaces of the temple. Above the flames, smoke rises in a slow, translucent column that bends slightly whenever the door's faint draft brushes the space or when she shifts on the bench. The lamp flame holds its unwavering line on the shelf, a smaller echo of the hearth's constant burning. The night stretches ahead, wide and calm. Somewhere in the distance of memory, processions move through sunlight, crowds roar in amphitheaters, and chance encounters in the streets alter the courses of individual lives. All of that is part of her story too, but here, In the immediate intimacy of this circle of light, those louder moments feel far away. What is present and tangible is the fire, the stone, the slow, steady pulse of breath in her chest and in yours, sitting beside her. It is in these deep hours, when the city's noise has thinned and the rituals of the day have withdrawn into an inward echo, that she thinks most clearly about the nature of her watch. She has known honors, seats of privilege, glances of respect, the peculiar freedom to move through Rome unaccompanied, and she has known the weight of being a symbol, of standing as a visible guarantee of continuity. Yet, at the heart of all that, there is always this, the simple, repetitive act of keeping a fire alive. In her mind, the years blur together, not as a confusion but as a gentle layering. She remembers standing at the temple door in full ceremonial dress, as processions moved along the Via Sacra, carrying offerings and banners, the smell of incense thick in the air. The crowd spread out like a living tapestry, each person a small node of attention, their collective gaze sometimes turning toward her and her companions with curiosity and reverence. She remembers the feel of the decorated veil on her head, the weight of the fillets wound into her hair, the way the sunlight glared off polished surfaces until everything looked edged in white fire. She remembers sitting in reserved seats at games, the clamor of thousands folding around her like waves. From those high places, the arena below was a bright, dusty stage where bodies moved in patterns of competition and display. While others shouted and gestured, swept up in the excitement, she held herself calm, her expression composed. Her presence there was less about personal enjoyment and more about reassurance. If the Vestals sat serene and untroubled, people believed, then the city's relationship with its gods must still be intact. Her stillness became, inadvertently, a kind of public vow. She remembers walking through the streets with attendants, the hem of her garments held clear of mud and refuse, the crowd parting in front of her as much from superstition as from respect. Men stepped aside, their eyes flickering away, women watched more openly, their faces complex fields of emotion, admiration for her status, pity for her constraints, curiosity about the woman beneath the sacred role. Children pointed or stared, tugged at sleeves to ask questions that might or might not be answered. Through it all, she walked in a small, invisible corridor of separation, both seen by everyone and truly known by very few. She remembers, too, the incident in which a condemned man's fate shifted at the lightest brush of contact. The details come back to her in a slow, unfolding sequence: the shuffled footsteps of the prisoner, the clank of his chains, the knot of guards around him, their grips firm on spear and strap, the murmuring crowd opening a lane through which they passed. She was crossing one of the wider streets then, her attendants flanking her, moving according to a timetable and a route that had nothing to do with that man. Yet in the small, crowded space, a misstep or a stumble brought him close. His shoulder grazed the edge of her cloak, nothing more than that, a shift of wool, a brief transfer of warmth, and suddenly the air around them changed. The guards halted, faces tightening, eyes darting to her. The crowd's murmur rose, rippled outward in a widening circle, people pushing closer and craning for a view. The law, old and uncompromising, spoke without words: a condemned man who touched a Vestal on his way to execution must be set free. She did nothing dramatic. She did not plead, did not argue, did not raise her hand in benediction. She simply stood, steady, as the men around her began to reinterpret their orders. The chains were removed, the man's expression shifted from stunned fear to something rawer and more difficult to read. He looked at her once, as if seeking some explanation or reassurance, but whatever he saw in her face was hidden behind the formal calm she had learned to wear. Then he was led away, not toward death but back into the city's uncertain maze of possibilities. In her life, this was only one incident among many, but its shape remains distinct. It was a moment when the abstract weight of her role collided with the very concrete trajectory of another person's life. Without any decision on her part, without any action beyond walking where she was scheduled to walk, an old rule had asserted itself, changing the pattern of someone else's days. The knowledge that such things can happen, that one's existence, carried in a certain way, can become a hinge on which other lives turn, has never quite left her. Now, in the quiet of the temple, these memories do not trouble her. They drift past like pieces of pale cloth in slow water, glimpsed and then allowed to float away. The fire in front of her is immediate and clear, its need simple and straightforward in a way that the complexities of law and honor and chance are not. Her thoughts slide further back, beyond the bright public moments, beyond the accidents and intersections, to the nights of her early service, when everything seemed so much larger, so much more mysterious. She remembers her first full night watch in this temple with a vividness that the more recent years cannot match. She stood where she stands now, but her body then was still slender with adolescence, her bones not yet fully set, her muscles easily jolted by sudden noises. The darkness felt thicker then, pressing in from the corners, and the hearth fire, though no larger than it is now, seemed immense, its light almost too bright for her eyes. The senior Vestal who guided her then was tall and self-contained, her presence like a strong pillar in the room. She moved with an assurance that came from long familiarity, her hands executing the rituals with an unself-conscious grace. When she spoke, her voice was low and even, carrying easily but without any strain, like water flowing along a well-worn channel. That voice had told the novice to watch the fire, and in doing so had offered not just a practical instruction but a template for inner steadiness. The girl took the words deeply to heart. She watched the way the flames moved over the logs, the way embers glowed and dimmed, the way the entire structure of the fire seemed to breathe. She listened to the minute shifts in sound and learned to distinguish between them, the healthy crackle of wood burning cleanly, the damp hiss that warned of wood not yet fully dried, the sullen, muffled noises that meant ash was choking the coals and needed to be cleared. At first, every small change in the fire frightened her. A momentary flare made her fear she had overfed it, a brief diminution made her worry that it was about to go out. Each adjustment she made with the bronze tool felt perilous, as if she might, with one clumsy motion, undo the continuity that had been entrusted to this place for generations. Her heart beat fast, her palms grew slick. She blinked too often, afraid to miss something important, her eyes burning with the effort of constant vigilance. Gradually, under the steady presence of her teacher, she began to feel the rhythms that underlay the apparent unpredictability. She saw how the fire ebbed and flowed in response to its fuel, how it had patterns of hunger and contentment. She learned how long a given configuration of wood and embers would last. She began to sense, in her body, when it was time to act and when it was best to wait and let the fire adjust itself. Those nights were the first time she truly felt the weight of her responsibility, not as an abstract idea but as a physical reality. If she failed, the hearth might go dark. If the hearth went dark, the symbolic center of Rome's domestic life would be shaken. People would speak of bad omens, of neglected duties, of divine displeasure. The idea of being the cause of such a rupture pressed on her chest like a stone. Yet, as the hours went by and the fire remained alive under her care, another feeling began to grow alongside the fear, a slow, quiet confidence that perhaps she could do this, that her hands and eyes and breath could be trained to meet the task. Over many such nights, the edges of her anxiety wore down. The fear did not vanish entirely, it remained as a sober awareness in the background. But it was joined, and eventually overshadowed, by familiarity. She began to feel the hearth not as an alien, sacred object that might reject her, but as a living presence whose needs she understood. Just as a mother learns the particular cries and gestures of her child, the different meanings of a twitch or a whimper, she learned the language of the fire, not through words, but through color, sound, heat, and rhythm. Those nights etched themselves into her very posture. Standing in the temple, waiting and watching, shaped the way her muscles held tension and then released it, shaped the way her shoulders sloped and her spine balanced. The patterns of tending the hearth became, over time, as automatic as walking, as unconsciously precise as lifting a piece of bread to the lips. They sank into her bones and nerves until she could no longer separate where her own habits ended and the ritual's demands began. The hours of the night continue to pass, though here in the temple there is no immediate way to count them. No clepsydra drips audibly nearby, no marked candles burn down in measured segments. Time is instead marked by subtler shifts, the gradual cooling of the stone floor, the very slight softening of the fire's heat on your face between one tending and the next, the way the darkness outside thickens and then, almost imperceptibly, begins to thin. Beyond the temple walls, Rome breathes in its sleep. A late cart rattles by now and then, its wheels striking the irregularities of the pavement with slower, more spaced-out blows than those of the daytime traffic. Somewhere, a voice calls and is answered, the words too faint to distinguish but carrying a note of weary humor or impatience. A dog gives a sudden barking flourish at some invisible disturbance, then quiets when nothing more comes of it. These sounds arrive as distant, muffled impressions, softened by layers of stone and air before they reach you. Inside, the fire's glow pools around the hearth in a warm, undulating circle. The walls nearest the flames are bathed in a reddish, breathing light that sways gently as the fire shifts, making the plaster seem to move in slow motion. Shadows cling more thickly in the recesses between the columns, in the curve where wall meets floor, in the farthest reaches of the roof. The lamp on its shelf continues its more modest work, keeping its portion of the chamber in a steady, golden half-light. The older Vestal sits on the bench, cloak wrapped around her, hands resting in her lap or lightly on the warm stone beside her. Her eyes, though they have grown accustomed to darkness over many years, still reflect the fire in tiny, wavering points. At times, she closes them for a few breaths, letting the warmth and the familiar sounds wash over her without the mediation of sight, trusting that any significant change in the fire's behavior will call to some part of her awareness and draw her back. When she opens them again, the scene before her is always the same, always slightly different, the logs a little more consumed, the pattern of embers subtly rearranged, the light tracing new paths over stone and cloth. From time to time, she rises and walks a slow circuit along the inside of the wall. Her path is not random, it follows a gentle arc that keeps her at a certain distance from the hearth, close enough to feel its warmth on her left side as she passes, far enough that the heat does not become oppressive. Her sandals make soft contact with the marble, each step leaving a faint echo that slides along the curve of the wall and returns in a whisper. Her hand, when it brushes the plaster, feels a coolness appropriate to the hour, a thin sheen of moisture where the night's air meets the stone. In these quiet tours of the temple's interior, she sometimes looks up toward the smoke hole, watching the thin stream of darker air rising toward the cutout of sky. The stars visible there will imperceptibly as the earth turns, their positions changing so slowly that only someone who has watched many nights from the same place would notice. She has seen those rotations again and again, the familiar patterns of constellations shifting, returning, fading with the seasons, and yet they still give her a small, contained sense of wonder. You follow her gaze, letting it drift upward, then back down to the hearth, then outward to the unseen city beyond the walls. Each time your attention returns to the fire, it feels like coming back to a center, to a pulse that grounds you. The repetition is not tedious, it is restful. The mind, given simple, steady sensations to attend to, begins to soften its grasp on more complicated thoughts, on plans and regrets and questions that belong to daylight. After an interval, she pauses once more near the doorway and listens. The silence beyond is thick now, the earlier scattered noises having dwindled. Perhaps a watchman paces somewhere on a nearby wall, his sandals making a rhythm on a different set of stones. Perhaps a slave stirs in a side chamber, pulling a cloak more tightly around himself. But none of these small movements draw near. The forum lies mostly empty, its expanse of paving stones holding the chill of the hours before dawn. She opens the door just enough to let her senses stretch outward. The cold air that slides in is tinged with the faint, metallic smell that often rises in low places at night, where dampness gathers in cracks and seams. It carries a hint of the Tiber, that broad, patient river not far away, whose own restless flow feeds the life of the city. She can almost taste the mineral traces of it on her tongue when she inhales. Outside, the great structures of the Forum are invisible in detail but present in mass. She has walked those open spaces in daylight more times than she can count. Her body remembers the scale and proportions of the place even when her eyes cannot see them. The basilicas with their wide, echoing interiors, the taller temples with their flights of steps and lines of columns, the arches under which processions have passed in formal splendor, all of these stand now in the same positions, but their visual authority has been folded inward. At night they rest, as she does when she lies on her narrow couch, their outlines softened, their inscriptions unreadable, their edges no longer sharp. The emptiness is not complete. There might be a faint, distant glimmer of a torch carried by some late traveler or guard, a thin wisp of smoke from a brazier that someone has allowed to burn low, the quiet murmur of two men speaking near a gateway. Yet these traces are like breath on a mirror, visible for a moment, then gone, leaving the underlying structure unchanged. The Forum, like the city, is not truly without life even in its deepest darkness. It simply shifts into a different mode of being, one in which everything moves more slowly, more quietly, more inwardly. Satisfied that there is no disturbance wrapping itself around the temple, she closes the door again. The wooden bar settles back into its supports with the tiniest of thuds, as if the building itself is exhaling. She turns back to the hearth. And as her fingers touch the warm stone rim once more, her thoughts incline toward a broader understanding of what she has protected all these years. The hearth is a real, physical object, stone and fire, ash and smoke, but it is also an image, a focus for meanings that extend far beyond this round room. In her mind's eye, she sees the countless smaller fires that dot the city, the hearths in ordinary homes where women cook meals and where families gather, the small braziers in cramped upper rooms of Insuli, where warmth is coaxed from meager fuel, the more elegant hearths in patrician houses, framed by carved stone and flanked by household shrines. Each of these flames has its own life, its own history of being lit and fed and, sometimes, allowed to die. People warm their hands over them, gossip beside them, make decisions in their glow, comfort children, tell stories, plan futures, remember the dead. Her hearth, here in the temple, is both one of these and all of them. It stands as the officially recognized center, the place where the state's relationship to fire, to domestic continuity, to the idea of home, is made visible. When she places a log on these embers, she is not literally stoking the fires of every house in Rome, yet some thread of association runs from this central act outward. People believe, in ways they may not fully articulate, that as long as this fire here is unbroken, the pattern of their own lives can continue. She understands that this belief is not solely rational. Fires go out in individual homes all the time, only to be kindled again from coals borrowed from a neighbor, from sparks coaxed out of cold ash. But there is comfort in having a single, steady flame at the city's heart, tended by hands that are set apart for that purpose alone. It provides a focus for anxieties that might otherwise disperse into free-floating unease. When drought threatens, when rumors of war spread, when strange portents are reported, people look, in their thoughts if not with their eyes, toward this temple and ask themselves, is the fire still burning? For 30 years, she has answered that question with her presence. Her life has been, in essence, an ongoing promise that someone is always here, watching, feeding, caring. The symbolic weight of that promise is something she feels more clearly now, near the end of her service, than she did at the beginning. It is no longer simply a duty imposed from without, it has become a part of how she understands herself. Her hand rests on the stone a moment longer, feeling the deep, stored heat that has seeped into it. This warmth is not only from tonight's fire but from countless nights before, from years and decades of burning. The hearth is a reservoir of remembered energy. When she removes her hand, the heat clings to her skin, as if a little of that accumulated continuity has been temporarily transferred to her. Eventually, the weight of the night draws her back once more toward rest. Her body, trained to endure long watches, still needs intervals of lying down, of letting muscles slacken fully, of allowing joints to ease. She leaves the fire in a stable state, coals banked, wood arranged so that it will feed the flame gradually. The lamp's modest glow continues its work, a faithful, lower light to keep the shadows from becoming complete. She returns to the house along the same route she has already walked tonight. The repetition holds a comfort of its own. The stones underfoot feel familiar, the faint unevenness in one step, the slight dip near a drain, the tiny ridge where two paving slabs meet, all these small irregularities are known to her soles. She does not need to look down to avoid stumbling. In the courtyard, the water basins still mirror the slice of sky above, though that slice has shifted in tone. The deep blue has perhaps softened by a shade or two, hinting at changes still far off. The statues stand unchanged, their marble surfaces now carrying a cooler temperature than earlier, having lost whatever warmth the day gave them. If she were to lay her palm against one, she would feel stone that seems to pull heat from her skin, reminding her of its slower, more impersonal relationship to time. The upper corridor accepts her back with the same quiet as before. Her room receives her like a patient, uncomplaining friend. She sets down the lamp, adjusts the wick a fraction to reduce the flame further, and lies down on the couch. This time she allows herself to recline fully, her head settling into the familiar hollow of the cushion, her body elongating along the length of the mattress until her heels find the slight give at its end. The blanket draws over her with a soft weight, its woolly texture pressing gently against her clothing. Beneath her, the mattress's stuffing shifts to accommodate the contours of her shoulders and hips, a subtle, yielding pressure. The stone wall beside the couch holds a coolness that seeps through the thin layer of plaster, a sensation she feels through the blanket where it brushes her arm, a reminder of the larger, less yielding world in which this small pocket of warmth exists. Her breathing slows of its own accord, as if responding to an inner cue. Each inhale seems to fill not only her lungs but the small space of the room, drawing in the mingled scents of oil and wool and old wood. Each exhale releases a fraction of tension, sending it drifting upward to dissipate near the ceiling where shadows gather. Her eyes close, and behind her lids the lingering impressions of firelight and stone walls continue to glow faintly, like afterimages. In this half-held place, she does not fall immediately into deep sleep. The long practice of being available to wake at short notice keeps her somewhere near the surface, floating rather than sinking. Thoughts come and go, not as coherent lines of reasoning but as glancing impressions. The brightness of the forum that day long ago when she was chosen, the white dust of flour on her younger hands, the roar of a stadium crowd, the soft weight of a novice's fingers squeezing her own in fear, the feeling of a condemned man's shoulder skimming her cloak. These images drift up in no particular order, like fragments of pottery in a slow-moving stream. She does not chase them. She lets each fragment appear, float past, and recede. There are darker possibilities embedded within her memories as well, moments when the city's anxieties turned toward the gods, and by extension toward their servants, stories of punishments for negligence whispered among the novices, nights when omens were feared and signs anxiously interpreted. Those threads exist, but she touches them only lightly tonight, like a hand skimming the surface of cold water without plunging in. They do not belong to this particular watch. The present is calm, the fire is stable, the sky outside is clear. Gradually, the boundary between her body and the couch seems to soften. The sense of individual limbs grows less precise. She is still aware, in some distant way, that there is a temple below, that a fire burns there and will need her again before dawn. Yet that knowledge has become so much a part of her that she no longer needs to hold it actively. It rests somewhere deeper, like a stone at the bottom of a well, while her conscious mind drifts nearer the surface. Later, though you cannot say how much later, she wakes or rises from that shallow layer of rest. There may have been some small change in the sound of the night that called her, or perhaps it was only the silent insistence of habit, an internal clock honed by years. Her eyes open into the familiar dimness of her room. The lamp still burns, its wick slightly shorter, its flame a little lower, but still alive. The air feels a touch different now. There is a subtle freshness in it, as if the world outside has rotated slightly toward dawn, even though no light has yet made its way into this enclosed space. She swings her legs over the side of the couch, the blanket sliding down in a soft heap, and sits up. For a moment she rubs a hand over her face, feeling the faint impression of sleep on her skin, the coolness of the air against the warmth where it was pressed to the cushion. She stands and wraps her cloak around herself again. The familiar weight settles onto her shoulders, firm and reassuring. Taking up the lamp, she adjusts the wick just enough to give a more generous flame. Then turns the door latch and steps once more into the corridor. The house is very quiet now. Even the small, incidental noises of sleepers, shifts, sighs, the occasional creak of a pallet, are absent or too faint to register. The building feels like a single, large chest in which many small, steady heartbeats are resting. The stone beneath her feet holds a cool steadiness, grounded and indifferent to the rhythms of human fatigue. Down in the courtyard, the sky visible above has paled a fraction. The stars are not as bright as before, some of the faintest having disappeared into the growing brightness that has yet to show a color of its own. The basins of water lie as dark strips still, but their surfaces now pick up a slightly softer reflection, as if they are preparing for the day's light even before it arrives. The statues appear a little less ghostly, their outlines more defined, though their faces remain unreadable. The passage back to the temple feels shorter this time, perhaps because your familiarity with it has deepened, perhaps because the end of the night imparts a slight acceleration to your perception. The smell of smoke reaches you sooner, and with it a sense of returning to the center of a circle you have traced several times already. Inside, the temple receives her with its accustomed warmth. The hearth fire has once more diminished, but not dangerously. The embers are glowing a deeper, more consolidated red, nestled among gray ash. The logs have burned down further, their shapes changed, their edges softened. The air's heat has moderated slightly, enough that the temperature difference between the center of the room and its edges is less stark. She kneels to tend the fire again, her movements slow and deliberate. There is a certain gravity in these pre-dawn ministrations, as if they carry not only the function of sustaining the flame but also the symbolic act of bridging night into day. She chooses her pieces of wood with care, places them in ways that will encourage the fire to rise a little, to brighten, to prepare itself for the coming light from the sky. As she works, her thoughts turn toward the end of her formal service, which draws nearer with each passing year. It is not an event she broods over constantly, but in these liminal hours, it feels natural to contemplate another approaching threshold. She has spent 10 years learning, 10 years in full performance of her duties, and nearly 10 years teaching and overseeing those younger than herself. The pattern that has structured her adult life is defined, she has nearly traversed its full length. Soon, she knows, she will be free in a way that few women in Rome ever are. The law will no longer bind her to this house, to these watches, to this hearth. She will be able to own property in her own right, to make certain decisions without the immediate oversight of male relatives. She will have the option to marry, to enter a household as a wife, or to remain unattached, perhaps retaining a small shrine of her own or offering counsel informed by a lifetime of ritual knowledge. She has seen her predecessors make various choices, some slipping quietly into domestic life, others carving out quieter, independent existences, their names less prominent but their influence still felt in subtle ways. The idea of leaving is both light and strange to her. The obligations that have weighed on her shoulders for so long have also given her spine its shape. The prospect of waking up one morning in some future year and not needing to check on this fire, not needing to walk these corridors or count the basins in the courtyard, feels almost like imagining life without a heartbeat. And yet, there is also a curiosity there, a small, patient readiness to see what shape her days might take when they are no longer latticed tightly around the temple's demands. She does not feel fear so much as a spaciousness ahead, an open area in which contours have yet to be drawn. The emptiness is not a void, it is a place in which something could grow, slowly, carefully, at its own pace. For now, she stands at a distance from that space, aware of it but not stepping into it. There is still work to be done here. She leans back from the hearth and watches the flames respond to her latest addition of fuel. They climb a little higher, sending out a warmer wash of light that reaches further into the chamber, touching the bases of the columns, brightening the patch of plaster above the lamp, making the stone floor's faint irregularities more visible. The fire is awake again, and with it, gradually, the world will wake. As the darkness thins outside, the interior of the temple changes in ways that are subtle but palpable. The color of the light shifts almost imperceptibly. Where it was previously the sole creation of fire and lamp, it now begins to mingle with a very faint, diffused illumination filtering through the smoke hole and any tiny gaps in the structure. The blackness in the highest parts of the room becomes a deep blue-gray, the edges of the roof's beams begin to emerge as faint lines. The smoke rising from the hearth is more visible now as it passes through these slightly brightened upper reaches. It appears as a translucent column that wavers and curls, its edges soft, its interior full of complex whirls. When it reaches the opening, it thins further, merging with the outside air in a way that cannot be seen but can be imagined, the temple's private breath joining the wider exhalations of the city and the sky. The older Vestal returns to the bench, but she sits differently now. Earlier, her posture held the contained tension of someone in the midst of a task. Now there is a looseness to it, a sense that the night's essential work has been done. The fire is strong, prepared to greet the day. The house behind the temple sleeps and will soon begin to stir. Her own body, though it will need deeper rest later, has weathered another cycle of waking and near sleep without strain. You sit beside her in your unseen way, and as you do, your awareness begins to spread out, to include not only the immediate sensations of warmth and light, but also a wider, quieter understanding of the space you occupy. The temple is round, enclosed, finite, but beyond its walls lie the extended limbs of the city, reaching out into districts you will never walk tonight. Streets where bakers are beginning to stoke their ovens, alleys where night watchmen are preparing to hand over their duties to others, courtyards where the first stirrings of animals signal the coming day. All of that is beginning, slowly, in parallel with your own stillness here. The woman's gaze rests on the fire, but it is softer now, less sharply focused. Perhaps she is thinking of the young novices she has trained in recent years, of their earnest faces and fumbling fingers, their nervous laughter in the baths, their whispered questions when they thought the senior priestesses could not hear. Perhaps she remembers her own awkwardness reflected in theirs, and feels a kind of tender patience for the cycles that continue beyond her, each new generation stepping into roles shaped long before they were born, bringing with them their own fears and capacities. She might also think, briefly, of those who served long before her, whose names are carved in marble in the courtyard, whose feet walked these same stones. Their lives, once vivid and complicated, have been distilled into a few lines of inscription, a few tales told in the house, and the enduring reality of the rituals they maintained. She is one link in that chain, neither the beginning nor the end, and there is comfort in recognizing that. Her individual story will pass, the hearth, in some form, may continue as long as the city does. As these currents of thought move through her, your own mind begins to drift in parallel. The details of the room, the grain of the wooden bench under her hand, the small chips in the stone at the hearth's edge, the exact shade of dark on the far wall, remain present, but their edges soften. The need to hold on to them tightly diminishes. It becomes enough simply to know that they are there, stable, unthreatening. The first faint notes of the waking city slip through the temple's quiet. A lone voice calls from somewhere across the forum, perhaps a vendor announcing that he is beginning his preparations, perhaps a guard greeting his replacement. The sound is thin and distant, more a contour than a clear line, but it carries a sense of transition. Another, different tone answers it, and then there is silence again. The night is not gone, but its depth has lessened. The protective darkness that has wrapped this place for hours is loosening its embrace, not abruptly but in gentle increments. The shadows on the floor are no longer black, but dark gray. The air feels fractionally lighter in your lungs when you breathe it. The boundary between inside and outside seems less stark, as if the walls have become more permeable to the idea of day even before any direct sunlight touches them. In this slow shift, your own body and mind begin to respond in ways that are paradoxical but natural. Part of you feels the usual, daytime impulse to rouse, to plan, to think of what comes next. Another part, more deeply attuned to the story's rhythm, takes this moment of transition as permission to let go instead, to release even the gentle alertness that the night's watch required. After all, you are not the one who must tend the fire when you close your eyes. She is here. She will continue to sit, to rise, to adjust the wood, to listen for changes in the air. Your breathing lengthens. Each inhale is slow, filling chest and belly. Each exhale is a surrender, a letting go that seems to travel all the way down to your fingertips and toes. The warmth from the hearth feels less like something you are reaching toward and more like something that enfolds you completely, a soft, encompassing bath of heat. The sounds of the crackling embers turn into a kind of lullaby, irregular but reassuring, a pattern that doesn't demand decoding, only acceptance. The outlines of the pillars and walls blur further in your awareness. It is as if you are looking at them through a thin veil, one that grows slightly thicker with every blink. The fire itself becomes a gentle smear of light, its individual tongues no longer distinct, just a central brightness surrounded by a halo. The woman's form beside you is reduced to essential shapes, the curve of shoulder and cloak, the tilt of her head, the small, rhythmic movements of her chest as she breathes. Thoughts still rise now and then, because that is their nature. A small concern from your own life may appear briefly in your mind, sharp and insistent, trying to reclaim your attention. But in this place, in this hour, it seems oddly out of context, like a single, overly bright tile in a mosaic of muted colors. Held against the great, slow continuity of stone and fire and years of watching, it begins to lose some of its urgency. You can acknowledge it and then allow it to drift to the edge of awareness, where it softens, waits, and finally slips away. In its place come simpler images, drawn from what you have experienced here. The reflection of stars in a still basin of water. The feel of warm flowers sifting through fingers. The smell of clean smoke in a cool room. The nearly soundless brush of a cloak's hem along stone. The way a log glows from within before it shows flame. These images do not demand anything of you, they simply pass through, like the gentle, random sequences of images that float behind closed eyes in the moments before sleep. As you yield more fully to this downward pull, you sense the older Vestal beside you closing her eyes as well, if only for a few heartbeats at a time. She is not yet free to surrender completely, but she allows herself brief dips into that softer, inner quiet, trusting that the smallest anomaly in the fire's behavior will recall her to sharper awareness. Her capacity to wake at the needed moment is no longer a matter of effort, it has become an ingrained reflex, like the way her fingers know the weight of a certain piece of wood or the exact pressure required to move a glowing coal without scattering ash. In these shared moments of near stillness, the temple feels less like a building and more like a body in repose. The circular wall is its ribcage, the columns its bones, the fire its heart. The smoke rising and leaving through the roof opening is its breath, joining with the wider respiration of the city and the world. You and the woman are like quiet thoughts moving within that body, not disturbing its rest, just being carried along by its slow, internal rhythms. The city outside will soon be fully awake. Doors will open, shutters will be pushed back, voices will multiply, the sharp ring of hammers and the clatter of carts will replace the soft, sparse sounds of night. Sunlight will pour into the forum, picking out every crack and seam in the paving, reflecting off bronze and stone, making the temple of Vesta shine modestly among its grander neighbors. People will pass and glance and perhaps, for a fleeting moment, think of the fire within. But all of that belongs to the world your daytime self will move through. For now, in this sheltered round of stone and warmth, you remain in the territory between night and day, between full waking and full sleep. It is a safe borderland, quietly held by a woman who has spent 30 years learning how to inhabit such in-between spaces without fear. You are allowed, here, to let go of vigilance. You are allowed to feel the weight of your own body heavy and supported, whether on a bed or chair or in whatever position you find yourself as you listen. You are allowed to sink, inch by inch, into the deeper layers of rest that wait beneath the surface of thought. The fire on the hearth remains your anchor, but you no longer need to look at it. You know it is there, as you know that the stone walls will not move, that the sky above the smoke hole will continue to lighten, that the woman will stay at her post until her watch is truly finished. These are stable facts, steady as the pulse in your wrist. With each breath, you move a little further from the immediate details of the story. The temple, the house, the courtyard, the forum, they all recede gently, not like a door slamming shut, but like a landscape slowly fading behind a curtain of soft, gray rain. The shapes are still there, but their outlines are kinder now, indistinct, inviting no effort. You feel yourself drifting, as if being carried on a slow, broad current. Above, somewhere far away, logs settle on a hearth, embers shift, a cloak's wool rustles as its wearer adjusts her posture. Down where you are, in this deepening quiet, there is only warmth, breath, and the soft, formless comfort of being held in a space where nothing is required of you. The night's long watch is not yet truly over for her. For you, though, it may be. You can let your awareness slip the rest of the way downward, into whatever depth of sleep your body needs. The sacred flame will continue to burn without your attention. The house of the Vestals will stand through this night and many more, its courtyards and corridors embracing their sleepers. The city will circle through its own cycles of darkness and light. And you, who have walked silently beside an older Vestal through one quiet Roman night, can now release the story itself, letting it become part of the gentle darkness behind your closed eyes, and rest.